Welcome to the Strides to Solutions podcast. This is your host, Esther Adams. Picture the end of a genuinely bad day. Something went wrong, a conversation landed harder than you expected, and by the time you get home, your thoughts are running in tight, unproductive circles. You could not fully explain what you are feeling if someone asked, and honestly, you do not want to try. Then a dog crosses the room and leans its full weight against your leg, or a cat settles onto your lap and starts that low mechanical purr, and something in you loosens, your shoulders drop, your breathing changes. Nothing has been discussed, no advice has been given, no words have passed between you at all, and yet something in your internal state seems to have shifted. Almost everyone has felt some version of that, and there is a story we like to tell about it. The story goes that the animal knows. It sensed your emotional state, it understood what you were feeling, and its nervous system and yours quietly synchronized until its calm became your calm. It is a lovely story, and in the last few years, it has hardened into something close to received wisdom, complete with talk of nervous systems coupling and animals holding a picture of your inner life. What I want to do today is take the moment seriously without taking the story on faith, because when you actually follow the science of what passes between a human and an animal in that quiet exchange, you find something genuinely meaningful sitting inside a lot of claims that run well ahead of the evidence. What the research actually supports is more modest than the popular version, and I think more interesting because the places where the science gets cautious are exactly the places where it gets honest. So, the question underneath this episode is not simply whether animals help us feel better. Plenty of people report that they do, and there is real evidence for it. The sharper question is what is actually happening in that exchange and how much of the confident mechanical story the evidence can currently bear. What does the animal really detect? What really moves between the two of you? And where does a warm, plausible interpretation quietly outrun what anyone has actually shown? To get anywhere with this, we have to begin with a fact about emotion that is easy to overlook. We tend to think of emotions as private mental events that happen inside our heads and get expressed outward through language. But the core emotional machinery in mammals does not live in the parts of the brain that handle speech. It lives much deeper and much older in subcortical regions that mammals broadly share, structures like the amygdala and the hypothalamus and the circuits connecting them. These regions generate the physiological and behavioral components of emotion, the shifts in heart rate, in muscle tension, in posture and attention, without requiring any linguistic awareness at all. The apparatus of feeling is evolutionarily ancient, and it predates speech by an enormous margin. That fact is genuinely useful, but I want to introduce a word here carefully because it is where the popular story takes its first liberty. The word is homology. When biologists say that the amygdala of a human and the amygdala of a dog are homologous, they mean the structures descend from the same feature in a shared ancestor. The way the human arm and the bat wing and the horse leg are all variations on one inherited blueprint. That is a real and important continuity. What it does not mean is that the two species have identical emotional experiences or identical social minds. Homology tells you two systems share an origin. It does not tell you they run the same software. So when you hear that humans and animals share ancient emotional structures, the accurate takeaway is that we share deeply related neural equipment and many conserved affective processes, not that a dog feels what you feel or knows your feelings the way another person might. The continuity is real. The sameness is an overstatement, and holding that line matters for everything that follows. With that boundary in place, let us look at what animals actually do detect, because here the research is genuinely impressive even when read conservatively. In controlled studies, dogs, horses, and cats show that they can pick up human emotional cues through more than one sense at once. There is the visual channel, which includes facial expression, body posture, and gaze. There is the auditory channel carrying not the meaning of words, but the pitch and tone of a voice. And there is a chemical channel, the scent signature of emotion, which humans barely register, but which some animals appear to read. Researchers have documented that these animals can integrate cues arriving through different senses, combining a voice and a face rather than reacting to either alone. In one line of work, cats matched human vocalizations, expressing a particular emotion with the corresponding human facial expression, and did so most clearly for high intensity cues. Now, what does that integration prove and what does it not? This is where I want to be precise because it is easy to leap. Cross-modal matching does show something real and cognitively meaningful. The animal is not running a single reflex to a loud noise. It is combining separate streams of information and discriminating the emotional valence of what it perceives, whether the signal is broadly positive or broadly negative. But integration and discrimination of cues do not by themselves prove that the animal holds a human like concept of your emotion, or is attributing a mental state to you, or is maintaining a detailed internal model of your inner life. Those are much heavier claims, and the behavioral evidence does not reach them. The honest description is that these animals are sensitive to the valence and the intensity of our emotional signals, and that is a good deal more careful than saying they understand what we feel. That care matters because the next finding is where the popular story tends to inflate. Animals do not merely detect these signals, they often act on them. Researchers describe this as functional understanding, and the term is doing specific work. It does not mean the animal grasps the emotion the way we would. It means the animal uses the emotional information to guide a behavioral choice, which is a functional matter of what the signal does, not a claim about private comprehension. The clearest recent example comes from cattle. In a controlled study, cows watched videos of a person displaying either joy or anger, and afterward, they preferentially approached the experimenter who had appeared joyful and kept their distance from the one who had appeared angry. The emotional cue shaped a real decision about whom to approach. Dogs show similar cue guided behavior in problem solving and social situations, and horses shift their heart rate, posture, and facial expression in response to human displays of fear and joy. What that means in ordinary life is that when your dog attends to your face and the tone of your voice, it is not simply registering that something is happening. It is picking up the valence and intensity of your state and letting that shape how it behaves toward you. That is a genuine capacity and it is worth respecting. But notice how much lighter the accurate version is than the story we started with. The dog is responding to observable cues and their emotional coloring. It is not reading your soul, and the studies that show cue sensitivity are not evidence that it is. It helps to know that this sensitivity to valence and intensity is not a vague behavioral tendency, but something with real roots in how mammalian brains are built, because that grounds the modest claim without inflating it. In the primate amygdala, researchers have found neurons that encode emotional valence and emotional intensity at the same time, with distinct populations signaling whether a stimulus should be approached or escaped, and how urgently. In mice, separate populations of neurons carry appetitive, approach related signals, and aversive, avoidance related signals, routing them to different downstream targets. Mice even produce stereotyped facial expressions that reflect the intensity, the valence, and the persistence of an emotional state, with cells in a region of cortex tracking those distinct dimensions. The point of walking through this is not to claim that a cow or a dog experiences emotion the way we do. It is that the machinery for evaluating whether something is good or bad and how strongly is ancient and widely distributed across mammals, which is exactly why an animal can be sensitive to the emotional coloring of your signals without needing anything like human understanding to do it. The capacity sits far below concepts and language in equipment we share. There's a nuance in this literature that I think sharpens the whole discussion because it warns against reading behavior too confidently off of feeling. Valence and motivation do not always travel together. An animal can register something as pleasant without being driven to pursue it, what researchers distinguish as liking versus wanting, which means that knowing an animal finds a situation positive is not enough to predict what it will do. Some frameworks now add a third dimension beyond pleasantness and arousal, an appraisal of how much control the animal has over the situation in order to separate hedonic evaluation from motivational readiness. This matters for us because it is a caution built into the animal cognition field itself, a reminder from inside the research that detecting an emotional signal is not the same as acting on it, and that acting on it is not the same as understanding it. The people who study this most closely are the ones most careful about the leap, and that is worth following, so the animal can pick up our emotional signals and act on them. That still leaves the harder half of the popular claim untouched, the part where the animal actually regulates us, where its calm becomes our calm through some direct coupling of nervous systems. This is the piece people find most compelling, and it is the piece where I have to slow down the most, because the gap between how confidently it gets asserted and how firmly it has been shown is the widest gap in this whole field. The proposed mechanism usually runs through two ideas. The first is emotional contagion, the spread of an affective state from one individual to another. The second is spontaneous mimicry, the rapid and involuntary tendency to reproduce another's expressions or motor patterns, which is thought to partially activate the corresponding state in the one doing the mimicking. Both are real phenomena. In humans, blocking facial mimicry measurably impairs emotion recognition, and facial activity partly mediates the link between seeing an emotional display and reporting a matching feeling. And emotional contagion clearly crosses species in at least one direction. Horses watching videos of humans expressing fear or joy show contagion effects in their own behavior and physiology, and dogs react to their owners' expressions with responses that track whether the situation is positive or negative. Here is the problem, and it is worth stating plainly rather than papering over. Almost all of that evidence documents the pieces, not the whole. It shows mimicry and contagion within human pairs, and it shows emotional contagion running from humans to animals. What it does not show, in the studies available, is the specific chain people most want to believe: a calm animal regulating a distressed person through spontaneous mimicry. That full causal sequence is an extrapolation from the constituent findings, not a demonstrated phenomenon. And there is a further complication that should make us more cautious still. Even in animals, emotional contagion is often decoupled from simple copying. An observer animal's response frequently adapts to its own situation rather than mechanically mirroring the demonstrator, which suggests contagion runs through mechanisms more flexible than straightforward mimicry. So the tidy image of your dog catching your calm by quietly matching your body is plausible, and it may well be part of the picture, but it is not something the current literature has actually established. The same caution applies to the most physiological version of the claim, the idea that human and animal nervous systems measurably synchronize. Researchers have looked hard at this, usually through heart rate variability, which is the natural fluctuation in the time between one heartbeat and the next. It is worth explaining briefly because it is often invoked as if it were a clean readout of how regulated someone is. In broad terms, more variability tends to reflect a nervous system with the flexibility to respond and recover, while a rigidly metronomic heartbeat tends to reflect a system stuck in a defensive mode. That much is a fair generalization, but heart rate variability is highly sensitive to things that have nothing to do with emotional state, including breathing, posture, movement, and even the analytic choices a researcher makes in computing it. So a higher reading is not a moment-by-moment proof that a person is regulated, and treating it as one reads more certainty into the number than it can carry. With that caveat in place, consider what happens when the measure is applied to human and animal pairs. A 2025 systematic review pulled together 37 studies of physiological co-modulation between humans and dogs or horses. The result is a useful corrective to the confident version. Co-modulation was statistically significant in 16 of the studies, only partial in another 16, and entirely absent in 5. The authors concluded that the evidence supports the plausibility of the phenomenon without confirming it as a universal mechanism. That is a very different statement from the claim that human and animal nervous systems simply couple, and it is the accurate one. The effect appears real in some dyads, under some conditions, measured some ways, and it fails to appear in others. It is also worth noting that the more consistent evidence came from methods that track the two signals as they unfold together over time, rather than from cruder snapshots, which tells you the effect is subtle enough that how you look for it changes whether you find it. The conditions turn out to matter a great deal, and this is where the research becomes genuinely interesting rather than merely cautionary. Coupling tends to emerge most clearly during free, unstructured time, when a person and an animal can attend to each other without an external task pulling on them. Its direction is not fixed either. In horse and human pairs, whether the human's physiology leads the animals or the reverse depends on who is leading the activity and on how familiar the two are with each other. And there is a finding that ought to permanently retire the assumption that synchrony is automatically soothing. Under chronic human stress or when a person is highly controlling, physiological coupling can stabilize shared vigilance rather than shared calm, tilting the pair toward what researchers call co-dysregulation. In other words, two systems can synchronize into agitation just as readily as into ease. Synchrony is not the same thing as comfort. It is a coupling, and the coupling can go either way. I want to be fair to the strong version too, because dismissing everything would be its own kind of distortion. Physiological attunement is well documented between humans, in romantic couples, in parent and infant pairs, even between strangers. And there is a respectable theoretical framework drawn from work on the autonomic nervous system for why an equivalent process might occur across species. So the hypothesis is far from baseless. It is simply far less mature and far less consistent than the animal to human version of it that circulates in popular wellness talk. The right posture is to hold it as a promising and partly supported idea, not as an established fact. Now let me turn to what the evidence does support more solidly, because after all that caution, it would be easy to conclude there is nothing here, and that would be wrong. What holds up best is not the elaborate mechanism, but the outcome. Interaction with a companion animal is associated with short-term reductions in some stress-related measures and with improvements in mood, and the shape of that finding is specific enough to be worth stating carefully. The clearest thread runs through cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. A large, systematic review of human and dog interaction found that the most common pattern was a decrease in cortisol alongside increases in heart rate variability and in oxytocin, consistent with a shift toward the calming, parasympathetic side of the nervous system. And there is a well-designed experiment that isolates the effect. Researchers put people through a standardized laboratory stressor, a task built specifically to provoke a social stress response, and compared those who had their own dog present with those who faced it alone. The people with their dog showed lower cortisol and lower heart rate responses, and tellingly, those without a dog showed a flattened profile in another stress marker that is often associated with a dysregulated response. That is a real result under controlled conditions, and it is the kind of finding that gives the whole area its credibility. Oxytocin deserves a moment here because it is the piece of biology most often invoked, and it comes with a real finding and a real limit. In a prominent study, mutual gazing between dogs and their owners was associated with increased oxytocin in both the dog and the person, consistent with a positive feedback loop of the sort you see in bonded pairs, in which connection begets more connection through a shared neurochemical channel. That is a genuine and appealing result. What tempers it is that oxytocin release in these interactions appears to depend heavily on the closeness of the relationship, with the strongest effects in the most bonded pairs, and that oxytocin is not a simple happiness signal. It rises in affiliation, but it also tracks other forms of arousal, so a rise in it is not proof of calm on its own. The gaze loop is real in bonded dog and human pairs. It is not a universal button that any human and any animal can press. I also have to complicate the assumption that all companion animals soothe in the same way, because the evidence pointedly does not say that. Cats are a clear example. In a study of people interacting with their own cats at home, the interaction was better described as arousing than as calming. Emotional arousal in the human decreased in some respects, but heart rate went up rather than down, and the relationship between cortisol and oxytocin looked different from the dog pattern. That does not mean cats fail to matter to the people who love them. It means the tidy image of an animal as a downshift toward relaxation is really a dog-shaped image, and even for dogs, it depends on the activity, since playing and walking engage a different profile than quiet grooming or massage. The species matters, the activity matters, the relationship matters. A single story about animals lowering our arousal flattens a set of findings that are genuinely more varied than that. But even here, the honest version includes friction, and I would rather give you the friction than a clean story that misleads. The cortisol findings are more consistently downward than the heart rate findings, which are genuinely mixed across studies. So, when someone says an animal slows your heart rate, the careful phrasing is that it may in the right setting, and that the hormonal evidence is steadier than the cardiac evidence. And the buffering effect has a particular shape that is easy to misread. In an experience sampling study following people through daily life, the presence of a companion animal buffered the decline in positive feeling that stress would otherwise cause, but showed no effect on positive feeling when stress was absent. The animal is not a general mood enhancer that makes a fine day finer. It functions more like a shock absorber that becomes visible specifically when life is pressing on you. It protects the floor rather than raising the ceiling. There is a study I keep returning to because it isolates one variable cleanly. Researchers compared therapy delivered with a real dog against therapy delivered with a robot dog, working with children who had autism or Down syndrome. If the benefit were mostly about novelty or the simple pleasure of something soft and dog-shaped in the room, the robot should have performed comparably. It did not. The children working with the real dog improved more clearly in emotional attunement than those with the robot. I will be careful here because the effect on emotion regulation specifically was more qualified than the attunement effect, and notably, the gains that were found faded somewhat at a follow-up several weeks later. So the honest reading is layered. The living animal's responsiveness does seem to matter beyond mere presence, and yet the effect is neither uniform across every outcome nor self-sustaining without continued contact. Touch appears to be part of what carries this, and it is one of the more grounded pieces of the mechanism story. There is evidence that physical contact can act as a social signal of safety, and that this can hold even when the partner providing the touch is an animal rather than a person. That fits the felt experience of the dog leaning its weight against your leg. The contact itself may be doing regulatory work, quite apart from any exchange of emotional information. But I have to immediately add the counterweight because the same body of research contains it. Some studies have found that petting a dog produced no clear stress reduction advantage over simply sitting and reading quietly, and at least one study using a speech stress task found no evidence that an animal's presence reduced stress at all. The touch studies are also hard to compare because they differ in the species involved, in how familiar the person was with the animal, and in what they were compared against. So, touch as a safety signal is a reasonable and partly supported idea, not a guaranteed effect that fires every time a hand meets fur. This brings me to the part of the field that I find most genuinely promising and that I also want to frame as a hypothesis rather than a settled conclusion, because that is what it currently is. If emotional support could only travel through language, through naming feelings and talking them through, then a whole set of people would be poorly served by it. And it is precisely for some of those people that the wordless channel seems to matter most. Consider autistic children with limited verbal ability. The dense, fast, layered social cues of human interaction can be difficult terrain, and there is a plausible idea supported in preliminary work that the simpler and more predictable signals of a dog are easier to engage with. In one detailed observational study, nonverbal autistic children interacted with therapy dogs largely through affectionate physical contact, through petting and closeness, finding a route in through the body rather than through words. There is a phrase from this literature that captures the appeal of it, the observation that recognizing the dog's otherness and its nonverbal way of relating allowed children to explore emotions without feeling judged. The animal's lack of evaluation, its complete absence of any verdict on whether you are doing this right, may be part of what makes the interaction feel safe. I find that genuinely moving, and I still have to hold it at the right calibration. The effect sizes for animal assisted intervention in autism are, on average, small, and in some studies, they are comparable to what an active control activity produces rather than dramatically better than everything else. The protocols and the outcomes vary widely across the literature, so the accurate way to hold this is as a real and humane possibility, a channel that may reach some people where other channels are blocked, offered as a complement to evidence based medical, psychological, speech, and occupational care, not as a replacement for any of it. The clinical value is a reasonable working hypothesis. It is not a proven comparative superiority, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to the families making real decisions. And there is a further honesty this field requires, one that the sentimental version almost never mentions, which is that the exchange is not automatically good for everyone in it, including the animal. Real human and animal interactions can raise stress in the animal itself. Dogs in visitation settings sometimes show the small signs of unease that ethologists watch for. The lip licking and the yawning that indicate the encounter is not entirely comfortable for them. The regulation we are discussing is not a one-way faucet of comfort flowing from a serene creature into a needy human. It is an interaction between two beings, and the animal's own state and welfare are part of the equation. Some approaches to using animals for human stress management now build in an explicit rule that if the person's distress is harming the animal, the practice should stop. That is the right instinct, and it follows directly from taking the interaction seriously as genuinely mutual rather than as a service the animal exists to provide. The picture gets more complicated still when we look at attachment over the longer term, and I include this because it cuts against an easy assumption. A strong emotional bond to a companion animal does not uniformly predict better mental health. In at least one study, stronger attachment to pets was associated with a greater mental health burden, an association that was fully explained by the person's insecure attachment to other humans. Perceiving a pet as insensitive to one's feelings has been found to predict depression, anxiety, and loneliness, and the influence runs both directions in daily life, with evidence that an owner's job stress can cross over to their dog through the owner's own rumination. None of this erases the benefits. It complicates the fantasy that an animal is a pure and uncomplicated source of well being, and it returns us to the theme that has run through this entire episode, which is that the relationship is a genuine relationship with all the two-way complexity that word implies. I should mention one more piece of the underlying biology and describe it narrowly because it has been stretched in popular retellings. There is a striking recent study showing that when an emotionally salient sensory event occurs, it is rapidly broadcast across the brain and followed by a persistent pattern of activity, and that this basic architecture was conserved between humans and mice, with a medication that blocked the persistent component, reducing the effective response in both species. It is a valuable demonstration of deep evolutionary continuity in how a sensory event becomes a felt state. But the study used an aversive stimulus delivered in the laboratory, and it says nothing whatsoever about pet interaction or about co regulation between a human and an animal. It supports the general claim that mammals share ancient affective machinery. It does not support the specific claim that your dog soothes you through that pathway, and it would be a misuse of a good study to imply that it does. So let us come back to that quiet moment at the end of the bad day, the animal leaning against your leg and the something in you that loosens, and see it now with everything we have gathered. What we can say with reasonable confidence is modest and still meaningful. The animal is picking up real cues from you, your face, your voice, perhaps your chemistry, and it is sensitive to whether those cues are positive or negative and to how strong they are. Interaction with it, especially when you are under stress rather than merely idling through a fine day, is associated with a shift on some measures toward a calmer state, most reliably a drop in cortisol, less reliably a change in heart rate. Touch may be carrying part of that as a signal of safety, and for some people, especially those for whom language is a difficult or painful route, the wordless channel may reach places that words cannot, which is a promising possibility worth pursuing with care. What we cannot honestly say, at least not yet, is most of the confident mechanical story that has grown up around the moment. We cannot say the animal understands your inner life, only that it reads and responds to your emotional cues. We cannot say two nervous systems reliably synchronize into calm, only that physiological co-modulation appears in some pairs under some conditions and is absent in others, and can even couple into shared vigilance rather than ease. We cannot say spontaneous mimicry is the mechanism of cross-species regulation, only that it is a plausible piece of a picture no one has fully assembled. The gap between what is felt and what is proven is real, and closing it prematurely with a satisfying story is exactly the move a careful mind should resist. I want to suggest that the modest version is not a lesser thing. There is a temptation, when the grand mechanism deflates, to feel that the magic has been taken away. I would argue the opposite. What survives the scrutiny is genuinely worth having. A responsive animal can convey emotional information, can be a real presence during stress, and may help some people regulate. And it can do all of this without our needing to believe that its nervous system is literally fused to ours or that it holds a picture of our soul. The meaning does not depend on the overclaim. If anything, insisting on the overclaim puts the real and defensible value at risk because it invites the eventual disappointment that comes whenever a story is discovered to have outrun its evidence. The deeper point, and the one I will leave you with, is about how to hold experiences that feel profoundly true while the science is still catching up to them. Your sense that the animal helped is not invalidated by the discovery that the mechanism is uncertain. Felt experience and proven mechanism are two different registers, and a mature relationship to your own inner life can honor the first while staying honest about the second. The dog leaning against your leg did something. Naming exactly what and refusing to claim more than we know is not a betrayal of the moment. It is the most respectful thing we can do with it. Thank you for spending this time with me. This has been the Strides to Solutions podcast, and I am Esther Adams. If someone came to mind while you were listening, a person or maybe an animal, share this with them, and I will meet you here next time.